But first, ever since the start of the pandemic, when people under financial pressure were allowed to draw down two lots of up to $10,000 from their super, 3.4 million of us, well, we then took out $36 billion. That's right, $36 billion from our super. And ever since then, there's been a lot of pressure, hasn't there, on the Morrison government to rescind Labor's previously legislated increase to the compulsory superannuation levy. Right now, 9.5% of your salary goes into compulsory super. That's about $10,000 a year for an average worker. $10,000 they never see. It's managed by your super fund in the hope of giving you a nest egg when you retire. Now, a retirement nest egg is a nice thought. But as Paul Keating was honest enough to admit, when the super system was set up 30 years ago, that money comes out of your pocket. It's not the government's money. It's wages you don't see because your pay has been diverted somewhere else. Now, way back then, we were all told that a compulsory scheme would help us fund our retirement, and along the way through, of course, help ease the burden on taxpayers of the old age pension. But of course, that's not the reality. We've now had 3 decades of compulsory super, and you know and I know many Australians organise their financial affairs as they start to retire to work the system, work all those complex rules to get the most out of it, and still for some, a part or pension after it all ends. Indeed, you might be surprised by this. I'm not, as I've sat there helping to put budgets together, but 3 decades on from the introduction of compulsory super, in a post-retirement period, so over the age of 65 years or more, 2/3 of all Australians, 67% of us, we rely on government welfare as the primary means of financial support. So not super. Of course, call me cynical, but helping people retire or easing the budget burden on the pension, wasn't that what we were told, said Labor? The compulsory super was all supposed to fix. Well, forget easing budget pressures. What made the whole idea of compulsory super so attractive to Labor politicians at the time was that the system directed most of the money into trade union-dominated industry funds. And they are now the biggest institutional shareholders for many of Australia's public companies. You want to know why so many public companies in this country have policies on climate change, or why the CEOs are so woke? Well, look no further than the former left-wing activists that now run the super funds and sit on the board owned by the institutional shareholding bloc so many of Australia's companies. Thanks to compulsory super, there's now around $3 trillion in accumulated assets that supposedly belong to you, but that super-managed super funds, well, they practically run them to their own behest. And each year, that money generates around $30 billion plus in fees that, among other things, pay the directors their handsome payments, those directors being union officials on the boards, and also help to keep the unions solvent as their own membership base shrinks. Given today, less than around 14% of workers in private businesses belong to a union. Now, it's no coincidence here either that despite the election mandate, Liberal governments have never been able to get through the Senate changes to the law that would subject union super boards to the same sort of governance standards of all other corporate boards. I mean, why would the left vote to bust up the best money spinner they've ever had? Super gives the left money, influence with corporates, and replaces the old dying union member dues. And raising compulsory super from 9.5% to 12%, your wage, your salary, when that happens, that'll tip another $25 billion or so every year into the honeypot and generate perhaps another $250 million in fees for the big super funds. Now, in practice, compulsory super has become a giant money go round, from ordinary workers who earn it to the super fund managers who control it, and then working people when they retire. You lose the money when you need it most to buy a home and raise your family, only to get the money back when you're retired. Many people pay off their mortgage, don't they? And then come under the thresholds to pick up some sort of pension. And unions and fund managers all the way along get their cut. You think, wouldn't you, that abolishing the increase, so you get more of your money now, that would have been a no-brainer for the coalition, eager to differentiate themselves from Labor. It'd put the Libs on the side of the workers and Labor on the side of the big end of town, and I'd argue help expose the real game of the union super funds here, especially given the government's retirement income review final report, which we saw released last November, said that 9.5% was already more than enough with some pension support to give most Australians a decent income in retirement. The report said it was home ownership, not superannuation, that determined whether retirees were comfortable or doing it tough when they retired, and suggested that the government should allow younger people access to their super to buy a home. You could hardly blame coalition backbenchers under the circumstances, calling for the super increase to 12% to be scrapped and for home buyers to have access to their money, given so many of them, so many Australians showed they wanted their money when they could access it during the pandemic. Perhaps sniffing the breeze as the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, at the time seemed briefly on their side. Well, that support from the Treasurer now seems to be scuttled if reports in the Australian newspaper today are accurate, that the government has given up on this idea. Given up on the idea, which means another reform opportunity lost, and in my view, means shirking a desperately needed fight with Labor. Now, I accept that politics is the art of the possible, right? And there's lots of things you might want to do in government, but you can't. Politics is also a contest. It's a battle of ideas, your side against them on the big issues and the values that matter. And unless the coalition is actually prepared to find some issues to fight on and fight them hard, then it'll be hard to see the argument, won't it, for a fourth term when that time comes next year.